Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome. Welcome to the second annual Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series at UWC. University of the Western Cape is a university with a history, with a proud history of political and intellectual opposition to colonial and apartheid injustices. And not only did it give visible expression to this through direct political engagement and community involvement, it also helped to shape the contours of the post-apartheid landscape in becoming an ideological home for the left. In tangible terms, much of the country's new constitution was drafted here. Key people at UWC were involved in the work of the TRC, and we remain committed to the process of re-excavating and rethinking the past within the complexities of present debates and pressures, especially through a continued engagement with questions of multilingualism, museumization, archiving, urban reconfigurations, and historiography. The Faculty of Arts is one of the most research productive faculties on the campus, and we have declared ourselves to be a research-driven faculty. That means that everything that we do, from teaching, research, curriculum design to community engagement, and of course publication, must be informed by up-to-date and excellent scholarship. In a context in which debate is increasingly being shut down and where intellectual inquiry is often seen as a threat, and the drive is to implement quick-fix policy without thinking through its long-term implications, we insist upon keeping open space for the kind of tough, self-reflexive questioning which is fundamental to the constitution of a society committed to the well-being and development of all its citizens. This Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series is one of the ways in which we seek to make our contribution to intellectual debate about South Africa in its local and global contexts. It's a contribution that we wish to make to UWC from the arts faculty, in that we insist upon the humanization of such debates, but one also that we offer to the region, in that the lecture is publicly advertised to all interested members of other institutions or simply members of the public. The idea is that the lecture will be delivered by an outstanding public intellectual. The first lecture was delivered by Isabel Hofmeyr, and we are greatly honored to have Professor John Mowitt to deliver the second of these lectures. Professor Mowitt will be introduced to you shortly by Professor Pramesh Lalu, who is both Deputy Dean of Postgraduate Study and Research within the faculty and also the Director of the Center for Humanities Research. But at this point, before I hand over to him, I would like to acknowledge the work that Pramesh and his assistant Lemise Lalkan have put into arranging this lecture, the advertising and the logistics. Without them, it would not have been possible. Also, thank you to Jeffrey Lowe for his assistance in arranging the catering and assisting with the advertising. And probably most importantly, our profound thanks to John Mowitt for agreeing to address us on this important occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. You must admit this is a great venue to talk about the university in ruin. In 1996, Professor John Mowitt delivered a lecture to a group of graduate students, which he titled, "This Joint is Out of Time." In it, he set out to reflect critically and theoretically on the discrepant formations of cultural studies in the US and the UK. The text that drew together some of the elements of the lecture was Stuart Hall's essay on the formation of the Birmingham Cultural Studies Centre in the UK. Thinking back to the packed lecture room in Falwell Hall at the University of Minnesota, where Professor Mowitt systematically located the project of cultural studies in the political and institutional conditions of its formation, I now realize how crucial that lecture was for several dissertations written under his direction at the University of Minnesota. Among the graduates in that class, the elaboration of key concepts and challenges for critical theory pointed in significant ways to the arenas of debate that would come to animate the work of many. These formative discourses have now received greater attention in an expansive and growing list of publications. Text, a genealogy of an antidisciplinary object, offered us a sociogenesis of the text as it called into question an apparatus of reading and an emerging formation of interdisciplinarity at the institutional site of the university. Percussion, drumming, beating, striking, which I should say is part autobiographical. John is a drummer of note. Sought to describe the feel of resonance around which the subject came to be inaugurated in the cultural studies debate. In Professor Mowitt's own words, percussion aimed to make sense of senseless beating and to grasp how rhythm makes sense in music and society. Retakes, foreign language films, discerned the effective critique of post-colonial cinema, represented in part through the work of Sembene Usman, from the aura of multiculturalism that surrounds post-colonial critique more generally. And a forthcoming book titled Radio, Essays in Bad Reception, promises to explore radio's central place in the history of 20th century critical theory. The book situates a communication apparatus that was a founding technology of 20th century mass culture in relation to an intensification in and of critical theory. Many of you might think that this lecture on the humanities and the university in ruin is particularly timely. It comes at a time when this joint, the university, has shown itself as once again being out of time. The assault on the humanities and social sciences in the USA and Europe, and the tendency for its instrumentalization in our part of the world, demands that we attend to the very question of the idea of the university. Unfortunately, we have, contrary to appearances, invited someone who is both untimely and unfashionable to deliver this year's Faculty of Arts Dean's Distinguished Lecture. And as you will see, this is not a bad idea at all. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Mowitt to Cape Town and UWC.
So, for those of you wondering why you would ever go into a thankless profession like that of teaching, this is one of the reasons. You have former students prepared to say lovely things about you in public to others. Thank you, permission. Thank you, Duncan. When I, in the 70s and 80s, was involved with varying campaigns to divest from South Africa, often my colleagues and I would wonder quite seriously whether anything we were doing made any difference whatsoever. I certainly, at that point, never dreamed that I would be invited here to speak in South Africa. So I just simply want to acknowledge that I'm very honored, I'm very humbled by the invitation. The paper that I'm going to read derives from a series of events that have been going on at the University of Minnesota. They, in varying ways, have been exploring the theme of the crisis of the university in ruin. The paper has 4 parts, and I will sort of acknowledge as I'm moving ahead, so you will have a certain sense that indeed this will end at some point. Part 1. My title, The Humanities and the University in Ruin, makes a direct, if singular, reference to Bill Redding's 1996 study, The University in Ruins, a text whose 15-year anniversary is now upon us. The reasons for this are several, but before delimiting them, permit me to state in very general terms what the following remarks are concerned to do. Seen from the heights of, say, Table Mountain, without the tablecloth, my concerns engage the status of the humanities as part of the history of post-secondary education, now that its traditional, largely Eurocentric legitimation, think here of Matthew Arnold's appeal to the categories of sweetness and light in culture and anarchy, has given way to a contemporary neoliberal legitimation, wherein the humanities is valued for producing flexible and multiply skilled worker citizens for the new global economy. Although Arnold's view could never effectively hide its compensatory character, that is, its valuation of cultural expression as the means by which to console those torn by social conflicts deemed unsurpassable, the neoliberal paradigm has demanded that, in a distinctly therapeutical register, we simply get over our despair about such conflicts and cynically craft, using the available technologies, cultural microclimates for private use. At that point, taste and literacy converge in becoming utterly and completely personal. The view advanced and defended here is that this situation, this choice itself, is intolerable, perhaps even unlivable. What is called for, however, is not yet another defense of the humanities, but something more fundamental and thus far more difficult. To clarify what I'm attempting to get at in saying this, I want to take up briefly a very important recent statement on the matter of the humanities. I am thinking of Mahmoud Mamdani's The Importance of Research in a University, a text that takes a bold, if conflicted, stand on the centrality of the humanities to the university in Africa. Aware that Mamdani's status in such debates is in certain respects complicated by the recent controversy surrounding the proposed closure of the Center for African Studies at UCT, a debate about which I know embarrassingly little, I will zero in only on those moments in this particular statement of his that help me clarify the purposes of my intervention. As many here know, Mamdani advocates that, quote, we have no choice but to train postgraduate students in the very institutions in which they will have to work, end quote. A view given autobiographical weight, and one designed to address the long-standing problem of the brain drain to the North and the West. Although by the end of his statement, Mamdani importantly problematizes the intellectual character of the local global distinction presumed at the outset, he takes productive aim at the problem of what he terms consultancy, that is, the propensity within Africa, and the continentalism is his, not mine, to reduce research to the largely empirical project of either confirming or challenging research paradigms produced elsewhere. Against the consultant, who is a master of nothing, Mamdani calls for the indigenous production and reproduction of experts, experts who will be involved in what he calls original research. In fleshing out what original research might encompass, Mamdani offers the following important evaluation of humanistic inquiry. Quote, in a university, there needs to be room for both applied research, meaning policy-oriented research, and basic research. The distinction is this. Unlike applied research, which is preoccupied with making recommendations, the point of basic research is to identify and question assumptions that drive the very process of knowledge production, end quote. Describing the Makerere Institute of Social Research, he characterizes the dual engagement of a proper research program by saying, quote, on the one hand, it involves a critical engagement with the society at large, and on the other, a critical grasp of disciplinary literature worldwide so as to identify key debates within the literature and locate specific queries within those debates, end quote. In characterizing these formulations as important, I mean especially to underscore Mamdani's insistent appeal to critical engagement as a way to think about what is distinctive to research that is properly humanistic. However, in placing the accent precisely here, I can also indicate what separates my own remarks from Mamdani's. Put concisely, what strikes me as underdeveloped in his discussion is not the distinction between quantitative versus critical research, but an account of the work of research that grasps what constitutes its distinctly humanistic value. This is presupposed in Mamdani's nimble step from basic research to the humanities, but it is left unelaborated by him. To be clear, what I am concerned to do here is to consider how a value for the humanities that appeals neither to Arnoldian Eurocentrism nor contemporary neoliberalism can be teased out of an account of the character of the labor involved in what Mamdani is calling research. Part 2. The class of '68. This somewhat impish designation for what is also known as French theory is, when not simply an object of ridicule, fast becoming a mere term of endearment. Before this process arrives at the 0 point of affect, it seems useful, perhaps now more than ever, to recall that beyond simply grouping a generation of academic intellectuals together, this formulation also foregrounds an important fact. It reminds us that French theory belonged to the structural crisis of the French university. By this, I do not mean that French theory was either the cause or the effect of this crisis, but rather that it was interwoven with this crisis, and as such, invites us to recognize that many of its signature preoccupations not only bear directly on the nature of the university, but they also, for that very reason, retain a certain immediate pertinence for those working to sort the current fate of the university as a socio-epistemological institution. At the risk of stirring an old post, recall that Jean-François Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition was a study commissioned by the Conseil des Universités in Quebec, written to, among other things, reorient and rethink the research activities of the Western University. Or, to pick another example, that much of Jacques Derrida's voluminous writings on the university, including his unsettling reading of Kant's Conflict of the Faculties, emerged from his activities within GREF, the Group for Research into the Teaching of Philosophy, that formed in response to a ministerial recommendation that philosophy instruction be removed from French high schools. Of course, the international student movement of the 1960s resonated profoundly in various national, theoretical, and political contexts. But in the French case, the snarl between theory and the university seems hidden in plain view. Perhaps the most sustained articulation of this snarl remains Bill Redding's The University in Ruins. Because this text has been so thoroughly combed, at least in the US, I want to approach it, as it were, by brushing it against its grain. Consider in this spirit the final 3 sentences of Walter Benjamin's The Origin of the German Trauerspiel. Quote, "In the ruins of great buildings, the idea of the plan speaks more impressively than in lesser buildings, however well preserved they are. And for this reason, the German Trauerspiel merits interpretation. In the spirit of allegory, it is conceived from the outset as a ruin, a fragment. Others may shine resplendently as on the first day. This form preserves the image of beauty to the very last." These lines, like most, say more than they mean, and certainly more than I can address in a short lecture. So I will simply observe that Redding's study has prompted us to hear in the melancholic strains of this citation something urgent about the contemporary fate of the university. And this, regardless of whether the buildings on your particular campus qualify as great. To amplify these strains, I digress. My early writing placed strong emphasis on the connection forged by Michel Foucault between disciplinary power and the disciplines. That is, those institutionally organized practices that we simultaneously elevate and debase by referring to them as academic. At the time, this derivative innovation in the sociology of knowledge seemed important largely because of the way it helped bring the anti-disciplinary character of textuality to light. Missing from this discussion, however, was the attention brought to Foucault's concept of disciplinary power, first by Gilles Deleuze and later by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. This attention spawned a structural, even historical distinction between discipline and something they called control. A distinction that in the hands of Hart and Negri was put to work to, among other things, cast light on Marx's own distinction between the formal and real subsumption of labor under capital. There is, of course, much to discuss here, but for my purposes, what Deleuze's emphasis prompts is careful consideration of what happens to the disciplines with the advent of the society of control, with the advent of the real subsumption of labor under capital, or expressed in the language of contemporary public policy, neoliberalism. Marx himself provided important, if unwitting, insight when in elaborating the related and undervalued distinction between productive and unproductive labor. He wrote, and this is late in Capital Volume 1, quote, "A schoolmaster who instructs others is not a productive worker. But a schoolmaster who works for wages in an institution along with others, using his own labor to increase the money of the entrepreneur who owns the knowledge-mongering institution, is a productive worker. But for the most part, work of this sort has scarcely reached the stage of being subsumed even formally under capital and belongs essentially to a transitional stage," end quote. As a reiteration of a parallel he earlier draws between professors and masters within the context of guild production, the later formulation invites one to consider both whether the advent of the global society of control, whether with the, advent of the global society of control, school teaching in fact remains lost in transition, somewhere between the pre-formal, the formal, and the real subsumption of labor, but also it prompts one to whether, to what extent, and with what significance does education factor decisively in Marx's thinking about the becoming real of formal subsumption. Now, from where I sit, the so-called transition is over. The university is a knowledge-mongering institution, and school teaching is largely productive labor, which is precisely why syndicalism has asserted itself with urgency, if not success, in so many corners of the educational field, but also, more ominously, why the drumbeat of deliverables, or outcomes, has become so tortuously loud. At the risk of squandering whatever goodwill these remarks may have generated, I turn now to a speech given over 75 years ago, namely Martin Heidegger's rectoral address, titled "On the Self-Assertion of the German University." This much raked over address draws out a hypnotically suggestive connection between the university and the disciplines. Arguing that to be worthy of self-assertion, the university must engage in a vigorous form of self-examination, Heidegger goes on to specify that self-examination ought to properly assume the form of a questioning that, quote, shatters the division of the sciences into rigidly separated specialities, end quote, and, quote, carries them back from their endless and aimless dispersal into isolated fields and corners, end quote. That he is thus binding what he calls self-assertion and what we would call the impulse toward interdisciplinarity is perfectly clear. So too, alas, are the political grounds of his questioning. But we need not endorse his studied ignorance of German politics in the 1930s to realize that precisely what neoliberalism has achieved within all precincts of public education, K through 16 and beyond, is the ruin of the conditions of possibility for what Heidegger called self-assertion. It has done so, and this is crucial, not by defeating or overcoming self-assertion, but by metabolizing and thus neutralizing both it and the interdisciplinary restructuring of the knowledge it heralded. How? By folding the relation of the university to its outside, say the state or the church, inward. Self-assertion succumbs to the compromising vagaries of so-called shared, sometimes also faculty, governance. In this sense, however controversial self-assertion may have sounded at the time, it has revealed itself to be little more than a reassertion of Kant's ill-conceived Faustian pact with Frederick II, the pact whereby access to enlightenment was secured by exchanging private service for public freedom. And this is actually an argument that Premish has made in the Apartheid University essay. One might well argue, indeed I'm prepared to argue, that this is the deep form of the public that the neoliberal call for economic privatization is designed to restructure. Surely this, at least in the US context, is what is at stake in the systematic weakening of tenure, in the uncontrolled proliferation of adjunct appointments, professional administrative appointments, part-timers, and in the legislative obsession with graduation rates and progress towards degree, in the near hysterical resistance to syndicalism, in the unrelenting administrative rhetoric of excellence and best practices, and perhaps most cynically of all, in what David Horowitz refers to as the academic Bill of Rights. That is, the farcical repetition of the tragedy of the 1960s when students in the US and elsewhere sought empowerment by making common cause with other social movements antagonized by the structural adjustments of empire, not, as is now the case, again primarily in the US, by litigating over grades or calling for some chimerical absence of, or declaiming some chimerical absence of balance on course syllabi. Put very simply, academic intellectuals are encamped in the self-assertive university that now stands in the ruins for which it had been destined. Inside, strewn in some forensically legible blast pattern, are to be found the interdisciplinarity, the internationalism, and diversity that are fast becoming buzzing beacons of banality. To catch hold of the new beauty that flares up at this moment of danger, to redeem the idea of the plan silhouetted by the ruins of this university, it will take different concepts in the hands of differently organized re-workers. Part 3. So how precisely might we conceive what I have called re-workers? This term I derive from reworking, which I spell re, colon, space, working. In the book I have just completed, referred to kindly by Premish, Radio, Essays in Bad Reception, I propose to use reworking as a novel way to translate Bertolt Brecht's concept of Umfunktionierung. More typically, this concept is translated either as refunctioning or repurposing, perhaps even reconstructing. All perfectly reasonable choices, except for the fact that they don't capture an important theoretical, even political resonance of the term. Specifically, they drop the reflexivity that mattered so to Brecht, a reflexivity that allowed him to suggest that reworking radio, one of his obsessions, had to be as much about radio as about work itself. In effect, radio implicates the labor of our reflection about it in our effort to recast its purpose. Thus, re-workers. Workers as objects of reflection, but at the same time, workers as subjects caught up in the labor of reflection, of repeating themselves differently. To save time, let me simply assert that an important step down the path I wish to extend has been taken by university theorists in the US like Mark Bousquet and Jeffrey Williams. Scholars who have insisted that we hear fully the word worker in the phrase student worker. With compassionate rigor, they have, in effect, reworked the concept of the student by establishing how fully higher education now takes place in the context of a thoroughly neoliberalized industry that services a clientele of future employees who are plunging ever deeper into debt to secure degrees of ever-shrinking economic value. Among the many virtues of this work is that it has helped to politicize, in albeit narrowly economistic terms, the social being named student worker. Yet as crucial as such gains are, they risk everything when we too glibly assume that they authorize rewording placards that read, "I support university workers," to read, "I am a university worker," where crucial differences are allowed to go unspoken by the convenient urgencies of solidarity. So allow me to repeat a criticism Bousquet et al. Have already heard. Namely, by treating the phrase student worker as a pleonasm, doesn't one effectively risk factoring the student out of the equation? While it is certainly true that far more attention has been paid to the student as a bearer of cultural literacy or as a builder of the nation, this is no justification for abandoning an opportunity to rework what student might mean now that we have taken the step of thinking with agonizing, not to say dispiriting clarity, its relation to the reproduction of the division of labor. Yes, students work, they are part of a system of wage and salaried labor, but how precisely are we to think this fact in the event of the specific labor of studying? This seems to me to be the precise theoretical challenge before us, and not only because it represents a move as yet untaken in an argument that concerns us all. So what would it mean to think students as reworkers? To grasp those who study, and I put it this way to implicate the entire field of intellectual labor, what would it mean to rework the work of study? Two approaches suggest themselves, and time will oblige me merely to sketch them. The first looms up in those heated conversations, again probably a bit more typical in the US, prompted by sympathy strikes, where students, often undergraduate students, accuse their teachers, often graduate students, with exploiting them, with taking something from them that is not rightfully theirs to take. This is a discussion, perhaps more prevalent in the US than elsewhere, although I doubt that it's absent everywhere else, whose political valences would be easier to crystallize if we spent some time attempting to detail what Marx meant when, as we have seen, he indexed the transition from the formal to the real subsumption of value to the industrialization of education. Yes, let's be clearer about what real subsumption means, but even more important is grasping and documenting the events of real subsumption as it participates in the extraction of surplus value from educational labor, including the labor of studying. The Weberian economy of prestige has perhaps been given a new and decisive relevance by neoliberalism's fatal attention to performance indicators such as the grade point averages and degree completion rates of student cohorts. The expropriation or second enclosure of such indices is routinely used on the academic market to establish comparative advantages over institutional competitors. In effect, surplus value is being extracted from so-called unproductive intellectual labor, and this produces a link between students and workers that is only the most oblique relation to their jobs. The second approach involves steering between two tempting but I think failed options. Both involve reworking work as such. On the one hand, there is the Italian workerist position. This has roots that extend back to Paul Laforge and his right to laziness, but which in the hands of Mario Tronti and more recently Negri pressures the concept and practice of work within the capitalist division of labor by, when all is said and done, simply refusing to perform it, by, in effect, conflating work with the exertions made to boycott it. Although the mediating steps would be time-consuming to trace, one might subsume this reworking of work under the heading of Georges Bataille's economy of expenditure. All of its many attractions notwithstanding, and to be sure, the refusal to study has become something of a competitive sport in the US, it should be clear that sooner or later, this approach, if grasped in and as the event of studying, cedes the university to the asses of vocationalization that can already be heard braying at the gates. When study simply reverts to training, something important to students is irrevocably squandered, and not, as Bataille would prefer to have it, in a good way. On the other hand, there is the option, roundly criticized by Jacques Donzelot and Robert Castel, among many others. It is likewise a reworking of work, not by refusing it, but by enjoying it. Although it would take too long to elaborate in detail, Donzelot, in a series of papers from the late 70s, showed with compelling force precisely how the pleasure in work movement developed in France to manage both ideologically and technically the subsumption of the social by economic processes, shared an alarming affinity with the joy in work rhetoric of the concentration camps of World War II. The immediate target of Donzelot's criticism was proposals circulating in Paris for protecting workers from the erosion of their statutory relation to their jobs, proposals that insisted monotonously on the virtues of permanent retraining and preventive medicine, largely means of managing stress and controlling depression. But in generating the genealogy of such proposals, Donzelot sets in motion concepts that urge us to locate the work of studying within it. Especially important is not just the matter of retraining our students, especially in the humanities, not routinely told by employers that they're keenly interested in their ability to retrain. But in addition, the rather crucial matter of grasping the place of pleasure in intellectual work seems to be one of the issues Donzelot puts before us. However, in his eagerness to alert us to the risks of succumbing to a fully calculated and therefore quite suspicious enjoying what one does for a living, Donzelot settles for an estrangement that only partially illuminates the reworking of study, where, in fact, something like intellectual enjoyment does abide. That said, what Donzelot does help us think about is the place of something other than the satisfaction of need in the event of work. A thought Marx himself, in basing use value on need, struggled, and I might even argue failed to grasp. Thus, if theoretical attention to the marketing of student performance constitutes one approach to reworking study, to recognizing that it is productive work, then the second approach might well be directed at the socially conditioned space left between boycotting and enjoying work. In other words, if we want to be clearer about what reworking the work of the student might mean, then we need to articulate in political terms the difference between refusing and enjoying work as it arises in the act of studying. Put differently, we need to grasp the value of what humanists do when they do it. Part 4. Getting close. When in 1971, Foucault was lured away from the philosophy department of Vincennes, he urged those attending his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France to remember that, quote, a real escape from Hegel presupposes a knowledge of what is still Hegelian and that which allows us to think against Hegel, end quote. I invoke this memory not primarily to draw final attention to yet another decisive encounter between the class of '68 and the Parisian university system, but to urge that Hegel's concept, found already in the preface of the Phenomenology of Mind, the concept of the labor of the negative, may help us tease out a practice suspended between refusal and pleasure. A practice that reworks the work of study, and in doing so gives us a way to value the work of the humanities beyond the impasses of Eurocentrism and neoliberalism. In the phenomenology, the labor of the negative appears when, clearly sparring with Spinoza, Hegel establishes the difference between substance and subject by asserting that divine intelligence, without the labor of the negative, devolves into edification, theology, not science. What science, and his word is Wissenschaft, requires is a struggle between knowing and being, a struggle based in negation, where the life of the mind advances by assimilating the object and negating the identity between the subject and the object, produced through that act of assimilation. If, as he will go immediately on to say, the truth is the whole. This is because the whole emerges in and through this very struggle. These days, I think, we find terms like science, truth, the whole, a bit quaint, perhaps even suspicious. But if we hear faintly rumbling behind them the labor of the negative, that for Hegel is a defining characteristic of the life of the mind, then perhaps we have secured new purchase on the work of study. Perhaps it is negation that lies between refusal and enjoyment. In a sense, Plato had defended the philosophical vocation in similar terms. In the Republic, he proposes that the value of the life of the mind derives precisely from its uselessness, a term taken up a century later by the founders of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton to designate precisely the power and importance of pure research. It was useless. However, what Hegel's formulation gains, I think, is an important and explicit reference to work, to Arbeit, to labor. So much so, in fact, that the labor of the negative can be understood to enter into a fecund relation with what Marx later called unproductive labor. That is, labor thought to expend rather than produce surplus value. For Marx, unproductive labor reached beyond mere consumption, the using up of things of value, to embody a logic that negated the logic of productive labor, a fact that helps explain, I think, the political danger of its real subsumption within capital. In the university in ruins, this general line of reasoning is taken up under the rather different heading of what Reddings calls dissensus. That is, the non-objective or goal of academic inquiry, freed from the quantitative pressures of consensus, formation, and reporting. While this maneuver feels a bit too tidy for me, not to mention that many of my colleagues have long been geniuses of dissensus, I appreciate Redding's insistence on the debate over the concept of community, from which his insight is derived. Because this debate over community sought to counter the assumptions of Hegelian and later Marxian sociology, varying claims about which was the more primordial social instance, the family or class, it also prompts one to hesitate before the concept of negation at work within the labor of the negative. What prompts this hesitation? In a word, death. A final citation from Hegel's phenomenology, I hope, will justify the melodrama of this assertion. Here's the quote from Hegel. "The life of the mind is not one that shuns death and keeps clear of destruction. It endures death, and in death maintains its being. It only wins to its truth when it finds itself utterly torn asunder. It is this mighty power, not by being a positive which turns away from the negative, as when we say of anything, it is nothing or it is false, and being done with it, pass off to something else. On the contrary, mind is this power only by looking the negative in the face and dwelling with it." Hegel, end quote. Hegel goes on to clarify that this account of the negative belongs to the very core of his theory of the subject, establishing beyond a doubt that he is not here formulating a therapeutic acknowledgement of death, but instead producing, or at least attempting to, an ontological structure of death that locates it at the very tip of the spear where consciousness and matter meet in being torn apart. Taken then as part of what is understood as the labor of the negative, we not only are compelled to grasp it as a synonym for the life of the mind, but we are likewise compelled to equate negation and death and conceive the labor of the negative as something like the work of death. Although his immediate concerns are different, Achille Mbembe raises related issues when he said in an interview with the French journal Esprit, quote, "The totem which colonized people discovered behind the mask of humanism and universalism was not only deaf and blind most of the time, it was also, above all, characterized by the desire for its own death. But insofar as this death was necessarily conveyed through others, it was in effect a delegated death." End quote. While this necropolitical reading of humanism reminds us to recognize Hegel as a European, it also lets slip, perhaps through its ableist assumptions, the provocative ontology of thought Hegel is trying to put forward. That said, and setting aside Freud's deft rewording of the death drive as the pleasure principle, it strikes me that however appealing Hegel's labor of the negative might be as a way to rework the work of study, that study would be the labor of the negative, it invites a necessary embrace of human finitude that risks desecularizing the humanities in a rather unhelpful way. Thus, it might therefore make more sense, and with this I will conclude, to engage another figure whose works routinely appeared on the syllabi of the class of '68, namely Friedrich Nietzsche. Specifically, what everyone from Georges Bataille to Gilles Deleuze responded to in Nietzsche was his insistence upon the power of something he called affirmation. Not by any means a saying yes to anything and everything, but an embrace of the continuity between consciousness and matter that the dialectic, whether Hegelian or Marxist, promises to restore, but only by first negating. There is, of course, an enormous amount to say here, but so as not to leave you both exhausted and perplexed, let me propose that we rework the work of study, of research, to invoke Mamdani, as a labor of affirmation. That is, as a practice arising wherever and whenever the human is at stake, a practice that grounds the critique of quantification and consultancy in a mode of activity that exceeds them. The point is not simply to assign a new value to the humanities, to shift its ranking in the great chain of being, but to reopen the dossier on value and to affirm the urgency of wresting value away from both its cultural and economic degradation within societies of control. In the process, we will not only be saying yes to the labor of study, but to the space and project of the university, whether in Africa or elsewhere. If we can formulate what the humanities does, perhaps we will also then know where it must take place. In this respect, Benjamin got it backwards. It's not the plan of great buildings that shine forth in their ruins, but the building of great plans that give ruin what value it has, whether on the first day or the last. Thank you.